Russia. What is there to say about Russia? Bears, vodka, and the cold. Name a more iconic combination of elements to create a nation. Russia has some massive effects on world history, especially nowadays. Throughout its history, Russia has had some very grand victories and some very difficult defeats, but none define the 20th century more than Russia's defeat in World War I and its subsequent fall to communism, defining both World War II and the rest of the century during the Cold War. But what if this wasn't the case? What if, instead of losing to Germany in World War I, causing the downfall of the Tsars to the Soviets, they managed to win the war, gaining concessions and boosting the public image of the Tsar in the process, eliminating the rise of communism? What if Russia won World War I? This scenario, even more than all of my others, would be difficult to execute in a realistic manner, due to the truly horrible situation the Russian state and government was in the early 20th century. So unfortunately, this scenario is necessarily quite unrealistic. Just to put into perspective how much I need to change to have a hope of Russia winning this war, here's a quick list. And even with all of this, there's no guarantee of a Russian victory, only a slight possibility. The first thing we need to do is give the Russian government some massive foresight, seeing that a cataclysmic war was coming, and that it was coming soon, preparing the development of new rail infrastructure to its western borders, as well as beginning the development of a railway to Murmansk, one of Russia's few ports with access to an ice-free waterway. The Russians actually did this in our timeline, though they only started in 1915 and finished in 1917, far too late to be effective. The new infrastructure is vital for receiving crucial aid from the rest of the Entente. Granted, the early creation of this infrastructure is a bit of a stretch, as the Russian High Command assumed that they would be able to safely receive support from their French allies through the Black Sea, so there would be no reason for the development of such a costly, useless port in the far north. Even though it might be unlikely, the Russian government could still predict that the current government of the Ottomans, the Young Turks, were itching for a fight against them, or they could possibly see a threat from Italy, with them being able to block support via their navy in the mid-Mediterranean. Next, due to their better foresight for the war, they need to start training their army better, or, barring that, stockpiling supplies for the war, both for the front and at home. This is critical for allowing the Russian army to continue being at least able to function against the Germans and Austro-Hungarians, and for keeping the civilian population happy and fed. The next thing we can do to help the Russian Empire out before the war begins is the implementation of a military reform, especially in the upper echelons of the army, allowing for greater communication, coordination, and organization. The army needs to iron out several issues between its generals beforehand, limiting disagreements between generals and minimizing the prevalence of rogue actions. Most prominently, Russia needs to develop a more comprehensive defensive strategy for dealing with their front lines, prioritizing a consolidated defense from the Germans rather than an attempted assault on them. Russia needs to realize that it's never going to be able to face the Germans head-on, so they need to work tactically to have a shot at winning. Here's a strategy which I think the Russian High Command could come up with. Also, excuse my pronunciation in this segment. I'm sorry to any Polish, Lithuanian, or Russian speakers watching this video. Using the Varta and Narwa rivers as initial defensive points, the Russians would prompt the Germans into fighting them. After this, they would begin to retreat back to these defensive points, fighting them all the way. Throughout this tactical retreat, they would utilize scorched earth tactics, which would limit German supplies. This gives time for significant defenses to be established along these rivers, so that when the Germans arrive, they won't have the resources or might to push the Russians out of these positions. Moving north, the defensive line would connect up to the Vistula River, where the same tactics are used. Next, the Russian defenses would finally connect up to the Nemunas River in Lithuania, following it to the German border until reached to the ocean. Then, in case of catastrophic failure of the front lines, a fallback line would be established entirely along the Vistula. Looking south, the Russians would plan to quickly strike the weaker Austro-Hungarians, hopefully goading an initial attack to be able to counter it. This attack's goal would be to push as much as possible into the Carpathian Mountains, allowing them to set up trenches all along the range and grinding progress on the front to a halt. The plan from here would be to keep Germany and Austria-Hungary in a sort of stalemate position, until the war's costs and lack of Ukrainian grain wore Germany down enough that either a push could begin or Germany would sue for peace altogether. Sorry to interrupt the video, but I'm contractually obligated to do that YouTuber thing now. Did you know that over 80% of my viewers are unsubscribed? To keep up to date with all the crazy videos I have planned, please make sure to subscribe. Also, P.S. I have a Discord now. The link to it should be in the description of this video, so if you want to check it out, it would be greatly appreciated. Back to your regularly scheduled programming. Now, I'll be the first to admit that there are many problems with this plan. Russian public would not be especially pleased at Russia essentially giving territory to the Germans with minimal fighting, and the use of scorched earth on the Polish territories are not great for Russian control in the area. But it's the best solution I could come up with. Now, moving to the outbreak of the war. Immediately after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the Russians would begin to secretly mobilize, as they did in our timeline, though they would also begin building their defensive lines, as illustrated in their plan. The outbreak of the war would come, and the war would go fairly similarly to their initial plans. A push into Austria-Hungary, scorched earth coupled with a strategic fallback line. This, along with other changes made to Russia, put them in a much better position to survive. All of our cumulative changes has allowed Russia to hold this line for about a year and a half at best. Yeah. Though these changes would allow a stronger defense, the Germans would eventually punch through, especially with the freezing of the Western Front, though this extra year is surprisingly influential. Instead of their defenses falling in August of 1915, the Russian army would at best hold these lands until late 1916 or early 1917. Where in our timeline the front lines look like this, they would instead look like this. A big difference, I know. But crucially, the Russians still have constant material support from the Entente, have had better overall success in containing the Germans, and have more weapons and food. This better position may alter the conditions leading to Tsar Nicholas becoming commander of the army, but again it might not. If these conditions remain, the Tsar must not take command of the army, as it would spread distrust in the capital over his German wife, and conspiracy theories about Rasputin. It would also place sole blame for Russia's failures on the war to Nicholas. So, if the conditions arise, an actual general be put in charge of the army, perhaps Alexei Brusilov. Let's quickly move south, where I've so far neglected to mention the Ottoman front, which, if I'm going to be honest, was probably Russia's best front in our timeline in terms of performance, managing to stave off the Ottoman advances and even push into Anatolia. Though they couldn't reach Constantinople, this was about as far as they could have hoped for. Now for our most crucial change. Lenin can't be sent to Russia. As many of you know, Lenin was the mastermind and figurehead behind the 1917 Russian Revolution, and arguably without his leadership, the revolution wouldn't have been possible. Even though we have considerably improved Russia's position, Russia is still horrible. The people are still not satisfied with the losses in the West, and the strain of the war is wearing on the Russian people. If Lenin manages to get to Russia, it's entirely possible that he manages to start a revolution anyway, eliminating all of our hard work and just leading to a similar scenario to our timeline. We could either have him die early, have him refuse the German offer to send him to Russia, potentially being untrusting of the Germans, or have the Germans never give the offer in the first place. All of these have a similar effect. They eliminate Lenin from the picture. Now, in our alternate 1917, the front lines are similar, being slightly better for the Russians, but the internal position is vastly improved, with a better food supply, more support from the Entente, and a not as shameful Tsar. And most importantly, no genius revolutionaries to bring the whole empire crashing down. And now, the end of the Great War. The Germans are unable to make massive gains in the east, and the pressure from all sides is mounting. The Americans are flooding into the west, the Russians and Brits are rushing into Ottoman territory, and now, with Germany's food and morale at an all-time low, some minor advances are even being made by Russia. The peace deal would be quite interesting, as Russia is likely to be more of a hardline backer of punishing the Germans, similar to France, due to the amount of Russian blood spilt on devastated Russian soil. This would likely change the western borders as well as the east, though it wouldn't be by much. Most likely, the only changes to occur in the west is the direct annexation of the Saarland by France, which is still a major blow for the future Germany, being highly industrialized and possessing one of the most major coal deposits in Germany. Looking to the east, the Russians wouldn't want to take too much land that could lead to future German aggression or more uprisings. Therefore, they would only annex parts of Germany that were dominated by Poles or Lithuanians. Furthermore, they would annex the mostly Polish and Ukrainian Galicia from the Austro-Hungarians. Furthermore, the Russians would annex Carpathian Ruthenia to incorporate their Ukrainians living there into Ukraine proper. Finally, they would puppet the Czechoslovaks, in the name of Russian protection and to discourage any future German expansionism. Looking toward the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, we can see an interesting change in its borders. The Hungarian Soviet Republic, which in our timeline would prompt the Entente to harshly punish Hungary in fear of the communist nation expanding its ideals, likely wouldn't exist. These communists were inspired by the revolution in Russia, and their leader only committed to the revolution because he thought the Red Army was coming to support him. So now, with the lack of the Russian Revolution, the Hungarian Revolution would also no longer occur. This may lead to Hungary being more favorably treated in Trianon, allowing them to maintain much more of their territory following the war. Minor side note, the Serbians, or soon-to-be Yugoslavs, could gain a little bit more territory following the war due to further backing by the Russians. Now, the final part of the peace deal, the Treaty of Sèvres. Likely the Russians would have been conceded Constantinople, as was their main war aim. Coupled with this, they would seize massive amounts of historically Armenian territory and beyond, potentially pushing for further punishment of the Ottomans. Now there still lies a big question. Will Sèvres stand? In our timeline, due to Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, Turkey was able to force the Entente to reconsider the peace treaty due to its military campaign, leaving Anatolia almost completely intact. But will this be the same in this timeline? Almost certainly not. The Russians' main designs were on the Ottomans, and so would be willing to go into conflict with Ataturk's forces over the issue. And with Russian support, it's highly likely that Ataturk fails in maintaining the territorial sovereignty of his new Turkey, possibly leading to even greater punishment, potentially with the Kurdish state being guaranteed under Russian influence, greater Greek territorial expansion, and the heavy influence of the new Turkish government by the foreign powers. But that's all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to stay tuned by subscribing to make sure you don't miss the follow-up video discussing the after effects of this video scenario. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to help my channel grow. Comment down below if you think that Russia could survive World War I. Click here for another one of my videos. Stay crazy!